very powerfully how isolated he's become in recent years. And I don't mean kind of politically isolated, but almost literally physically isolated. I wonder if you could just sort of elaborate on that, some of the colour that you've written about that and how cut off he's been during the pandemic, and also why that's significant.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting again to wonder how far, amongst all the many terrible legacies of COVID, how far actually the Ukraine war is one of them. Look, even before COVID, Putin was becoming increasingly isolated in terms of fewer and fewer people in his circle in general, but also especially he was easing out those people who had slightly different perspectives. Increasingly, he was just surrounded by yes men and people who essentially had the same background and opinions as him. He didn't travel so much. He didn't see the country. And then COVID hit. And there was this extraordinary biosecurity bubble that was put around him. I mean, for example, most people, if they were going to ever meet Putin, they had to spend 2 weeks in a government hotel under armed guard, it's worth mentioning. This was a very serious quarantine. And even then, they had to walk through this kind of bizarre corridor which was fogged with disinfectant and bathed with germ-killing ultraviolet light before they could ever reach the man that Putin's own entourage calls the body. Wow. And what that meant is that basically very, very few people who weren't in his innermost circle got to meet him. Life became viewed through, two-dimensional screens, and to an extent like the rest of us, but particularly I think it's his country. Very much, I think there's a sense that Putin is now isolated from Russia and from Russians. He has no real idea of what they think, how they live, or anything like that. He experiences his life purely through the manila folders that are put on his desk. I mean, he doesn't even have a smartphone. He doesn't go on the internet, so he hasn't even got that access point. So again, this is one of the reasons why I think Putin is not insane. I mean, he has some pretty insane ideas, but that's a different matter. But the point is, the most rational leader can make some deeply stupid and dangerous decisions if it's based on an inadequate and partial amount of information.
Absolutely fascinating, all that detail on his personality and how he's been living. Very briefly, because we're nearly out of time, and Ukraine is an enormous country, and evidently many there are willing to fight to the death. Do you think there'll be pockets of resistance for a very long time? It's not going to be very easy to take the whole country, is it?
Absolutely. This is Putin's big miscalculation. It's relatively a straightforward matter of defeating the Ukrainian army on the battlefield. But defeating the Ukrainian people, that I think is something that he will fail at. And that's why this is ultimately, I think, the beginning of the end of Putinism.